the EscapeGoat Podcast, a podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. Hello, welcome to episode 36 of the EscapeGoat Podcast, and we're back, kind of slightly ahead of schedule, depending on what I said to whatever episode you listened to last, where I was declaring my grand summer break plans. We are on hiatus, but this episode is probably going to get released at some point during July, and that's because we had sort of prior plans, really, and they're kind of tied to an event, really, because I'm very glad to welcome a friend of mine to the podcast that I've been kind of keen to get on the show since we started it, really, for various reasons, and that man is David Bean. Hello, David.
Hello, David. Oh dear, we seem to have an echo on the line already. That's not a good start.
Oh, is that? Are you hearing something?
No, I'm sorry, David. It was a joke. You said hello, David, and I had to respond in like manner.
This is the thing when you spend time sound checking before something, you're so paranoid about something going wrong halfway through that you kind of your humour receptors just shut down.
Oh, indeed.
Yeah, I think this is the first David on David episode that we've had, so that's nice and confusing for people. I mean, how are you doing, David? How's it going?
Yes, quite well, thank you. I think you're obviously aware about one of the major projects that I'm working on just at the moment, or thankfully at least not having to do all that much in the way of work on, because we are more or less concluded, which you will be introducing shortly, no doubt. But other than that, yes, quite well, thank you. How about you?
Yeah, not so bad. I mean, for people listening, we're recording this, it's the 6th of July now, so it's for any football fans, it's the day before the England semi-final in the Euros. So we've got no idea when we're recording how that's going to go. But it's good. I mean, I'm kind of fine, I mean, it's a weird year to ask anyone that, really, isn't it? I'm beset with anxiety and uncertainty about, the near, medium and long-term future. But other than that, I'm staying pretty sane. I had a little bit of a summer trip up north to Edinburgh and then Manchester.
Ah, yes. Which we both know well, of course.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So it was really nice to see the place. Actually, I went to Edinburgh Castle for the first time since I was probably about 12 years old, and got lovely weather for it.
Excellent. Yes, it's a beautiful, beautiful place, that. Yes, I can't admit to having had any grand trips like that, but I did manage to get along to the first performance of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cinderella, which was, quite a thing.
Oh, I saw you posting, I think, on Facebook about that. Yeah, how did that go? Very
well. It's surprisingly enough, it was not only the first time it had been performed in public, but actually the first time it had been performed start to finish at all. Lord Lloyd Webber himself came out at first, and he pointed out that although they'd obviously rehearsed it extensively, they'd never actually done a full run-through start to finish. So that was the first time they ever did it, and I got to be there. It was pretty good fun, I would say.
Wow, front row of history.
More or less, yes. I mean, a new Andrew Lloyd Webber musical is an event. It has to be said.
Yeah, I must get your review for that after the. It's probably a bit off-piste for even for this podcast, but I must hear your review of that after the recording. Yeah, I mean, we mentioned Scotland before. I should say to listeners, me and David, in common with a few people who've been on this podcast, we originally met in Scotland when we went to the same university, and when I got there, David was in the year above, I think, weren't you? So you were already one of the cool kids when I got there.
I was never one of the cool kids, but...
I'm doing hype for you, David. I'll get the hype train running.
I don't necessarily know what your demographic is for this podcast, David, but if it's cool kids, then you may have selected the wrong guest.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think we're going to probably probe at the more esoteric ends of our demographic with this episode, and we'll hopefully make something that's kind of accessible and interesting for most of them. I should say, I'll tell you what, David. Why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself and kind of what your background is, where you're from, what you've been doing with yourself recently, and then we'll get into why you're on the show today.
Absolutely. Well, we mentioned Scotland to start off with. I am from Scotland originally. I come from Perthshire, and went to St Andrews in Fife. Went to study there. got quite heavily involved in a lot of things at university involving things like debating student politics and what have you. And then when I eventually left the place, I went to Manchester, another place where we have a mutual connection, David. And so my first job out of university was working for the cooperative group there as a project manager through one of the graduate programs that are obviously fairly common. But sometime later on, having got involved in politics on a voluntary level, I decided that I wanted to move in that direction professionally. So I went back to university and read a master's degree in ancient history, having first studied international relations and philosophy. But I wanted to make that shift because I felt that if I really wanted to understand politics, then I needed to go back to the roots of it all, which here in the West would relate to Greece and to Rome. So I wanted to go and study that. Having done that, I then moved to London and went to work at the House of Commons for a group called the Policy Research Unit, which effectively is like working for an MP, except that you're working for virtually all of the, in this case, Conservative MPs at once. There's an equivalent body that works for Labour MPs that we had a very comradely working relationship with. In many respects.
I never thought I'd get you to say comrade, David.
Well, I mean, try hard enough, you might get me to hum the red flag, but I wouldn't necessarily rate your chances too highly on that one.
Well, I'll work on that. I'll wear you down gradually. So, I mean, that's kind of where you're from, what you've been up to recently. The reason I've got you on the show is something that I sort of clocked that you'd been involved with years ago now, because I'll be talking to you about two essays that you've written for a series of books that's been running for quite a while now. And this is the series published by Biteback, which is a publisher specialising in political books of political interest, biographies, essay collections, that kind of thing. And they actually have quite a wide range of stuff going on. And they've been publishing a book of counterfactual history, like political history essays. And they've been doing those. I think the fifth one is the book that's just about to launch in the series, and they're basically, it's hard to describe them as a book series because they all have slightly different titles, but they're kind of the formula is that the first one was called Prime Minister Portillo and other things that have never happened, and they all have that kind of formula to them, President Gore and other things that never happened. And could you tell us the title of the book that's imminently being released, David?
Yes, indeed. This one is going to be called Prime Minister Priti and Other Things That Never Happened. Now, you may immediately start to wonder about that. One of the earlier volumes was called Prime Minister Boris and Other Things That Never Happened, and then we had Prime Minister Corbyn and Other Things That Never Happened. The reason is that one of the specialities of the Biteback series is that they tend to include one example of an essay that actually is not about alternative history, but it's about a projection of some future event, some possible future event from the point where the book's coming out. And I don't know, and obviously I don't speak for the publisher on this, but I suspect the reason why they're doing this is that they're trying to generate current interest. That it's, while the bulk of it is entirely about history and about events in the past, they would like to have the opportunity to promote something that is a possible future. So, as I say, from those three, every other chapter in the book has been alternative history, but one of them, and it's generally the one at the end, will be a possible future.
It's funny, isn't it? Because counterfactual history, we'll get into some of the sort of tenets of that as we go on, but that's something bound to annoy history purists in general. And then if you throw in a speculative one at the end, that's going to wind people up even more. But I think, for the current interest, it's great, and it's a great way to sell books. I mean, I think the last volume before this new upcoming one was the Prime Minister Corbyn and other things that never happened, which was 2016. I think that one was published. So obviously that was a juncture, where even most Labour members, didn't think Corbyn was onto much of a future for anything, and that obviously proved to be a very volatile period, as indeed most of the last decade has been in various different ways. Yes,
and as you point out, whether it be for Labour members or for the general public, the idea at that time of a Prime Minister Corbyn was fairly provocative, just as in 2011. When Prime Minister Boris came out, the idea of a Prime Minister Boris Johnson was very provocative. He was still going through his London mayoralty at that time.
Yes, no, it was 2011. Yeah, I think in that scenario they've got them directly succeeding Cameron. I forget all the sort of twists and flips in it, but that's kind of obviously that's a very feasible universe that we could have encountered.
Yes, indeed. And then going back to the upcoming volume, the idea of a Prime Minister Priti is, I think, if you were going to pick a member of the cabinet who it would be quite provocative to suggest as a potential future prime minister, and I use that term very literally, provocative. I'm not trying to make any value judgment either way as to whether Priti Patel would or would not make for a good prime minister in anyone's opinion, including my own. But try to pick a member of the cabinet that it would be provocative to speak of as a future prime minister, and I think Priti Patel's a good bet as far as that goes.
Well, yeah, yes, because I suppose that for people on the liberal left, you might say, on any other part of that spectrum, she's almost the kind of mirror equivalent of suggesting that Corbyn might fulfil that role, right? She has the same kind of book selling tactic, the same effect.
Yes, indeed, something of a bête noire on the part of some people.
I do actually have a bet on Priti Patel being the next prime minister after our current prime minister, which I think I made sometime in, I'm going to say about mid-2019, I forget the exact timing, but I think before she became the current Home Secretary, put it that way. And it's a bet at something like 66, 70 to 1, something like that. So it's not a big stake, but, if Priti Patel ever does become Prime Minister, and it's not fixed to a certain date, it's just next Prime Minister, I'm quids in. So looking forward to reading the essay and seeing if I'm anywhere near feasibility.
I will not lay those odds.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to read that one, actually. I'm looking forward to reading that alongside a lot of the other essays in it. I've obviously, the only one I've read for it is your essay, which you've kindly made available. Would you like to, we'll touch more on the Biteback series and indeed on the essays that we're talking about as we go on, but would you just like to tell us what the essay that you've got in this book is called?
So the title for the essay that I've written is What If Eric Joyce had pulled his punches in 2012. And it's the title I settled on to try to encapsulate what could probably best be described as the Eric Joyce theory of British politics. And this is a theory that's been floating around in the popular and media conception for some time, certainly I would say at least since the EU referendum, which suggests that just about every significant event in British politics, excluding things that obviously couldn't have any relationship, such as the coronavirus emergency, but every major event otherwise in British and, by extension, much of global politics, can be traced back to one single night in February 2012 when an otherwise relatively obscure backbench Labour MP punched several people in a pub in the House of Commons. It's not exactly the Battle of Gettysburg, is it? But it turns out to be a lot more plausible than a lot of people, might immediately conclude just from looking at it.
Yeah, I'll be very interested to allow you to sort of express where you got to with that, and how into the plausibility weeds you went. Because obviously, having read the essay, I've got a couple of questions about that myself and a few thoughts. So, would you? I tell you what. Would you very briefly then explain? You mentioned him being a sort of fairly obscure backbencher. Would you mind just briefly explaining to the audience who Eric Joyce, was and is, because he's still alive? Who is Eric Joyce?
Well, I think I would prefer to answer that by taking it from the point in history that the story starts, from 2012, because at that point, Eric Joyce was the Labour MP for Falkirk, a constituency in Scotland, not too far from where we both studied, actually. And he was one of those people who had, in the past, been described as a rising star. He had been a member of Parliament since the year 2000. He was elected originally in a by-election succeeding Dennis Canavan. And he, since then, had a relatively successful early part of his career. He was seen as on the Blairite wing of the party back in those days, and as someone who had ministerial promotion in his future. So he never quite had the glittering shadow ministerial or potentially ministerial career that he might have hoped for. And there had been a couple of incidents in his past already in 2012 that gave some reason for pause. Some of these we only found out about in terms of the general public, later on. But it would appear that he had had some issues with alcohol consumption, and that these may have led to some, I will say in the most anodyne way I possibly can, suboptimal behavior on his part.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to say too much about that, because honestly, what actually happened, I think, in any situation in his life, a lot of it involves things that only he and the people who were directly affected by the things that he did can necessarily know too much about. And then, if we look at what actually happened in history since 2012, we find that his troubles continued. There were further assaults, and subsequently he ended up being convicted of an offence of possessing and repeatedly viewing child pornography. And as we speak now, he is under a suspended sentence, having been convicted in a court of law for that crime. And as I said, as I write in the essay, I had no intention of going into what it takes to drive a person to commit acts such as that. It wasn't the purpose of the story. And, if you look at the situation in 2012, when this, the key event, the event that we're looking at, happened, I don't think that it is necessarily safe to say that all of those events were written into his future as at that time. I think that he was experiencing at that time a downward spiral of alcohol-related behaviour. And so the scenario that I'm presenting in this story has him, well, he takes the advice of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Attack of the Clones, in that he goes home and rethinks his life. And that results in a lot of very important changes as far as the future course of events.
We'll talk a bit in a second about the kind of knock-on effects that this altercation had, but the actual fist fight you're referring to in 2012, that was did that take place in the Strangers Bar in the Commons Estate?
It was in the Strangers Bar, yes, that's correct.
And then that involved some other parliamentarians as well, I think.
It did, yes. There were several, most of them were Conservative members of Parliament and also their aides. I don't think it's necessarily makes sense to rehash their names at the moment. It's not especially relevant, but he got angry at a group of people primarily consisting of people who were also coincidentally or otherwise his political opponents, and he ended up lashing out, punching them, and well, the upshot was he was arrested. He was taken to a police station for the rest of the night, and of course the following day, immediately it was headline news, and that was when I, almost certainly you, and most of the country became immediately aware of what had happened.
Yeah, I mean, I was already a fair political obsessive, but I think it was one of the first times I'd read about him, and it was quite a dramatic way to put his head above the parapet, so to speak. But before we go any further, actually, David, we did say that we were going to address briefly the kind of the slight kind of entry-level jargon of counterfactual history, the phrase "point of divergence," and I think particularly because not all counterfactual essays and attempts use the point of divergence in the same way. Would you like to just briefly say what that is, and maybe a few thoughts on why you or how you used it in this?
Absolutely. The point of divergence when it comes to alternative or counterfactual history is essentially the one thing that changes. And I take quite a hardline view on this. I think that if you're going to try to write a story or write an essay that considers something in the past having changed, you have to be really quite definite about what it was that the thing was that changed. So, take the absolute classic example of alternative history today. What if the Nazis and Germany won World War II? It is impossible that every battle, every strategic decision, everything that was done by either or, depending how you look at it, all sides in World War II, were exactly the same as they were in history, and yet Germany won. Because the actual result of World War II was determined by all of those decisions. There has to have been something more specific that did change. For example, you might say, what if Operation Barbarossa never happened? As in, Hitler decides not to go to war with Russia, at least not at the time when he did. But, maybe he decided to stick out the war in Europe for a bit, try to knock the UK out of the war. Of course, the US hasn't entered the war by that point, but get to a more secure and stable position within continental Europe before turning on the USSR. Mm-hmm. That is a point of divergence. That is something that makes sense. It's a specific thing that changes. A decision, in this case, not to go to war with Russia at the time when he actually did do it in history.
It's the moment that the train tracks branch, essentially, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's when you decide that's going to happen. And I actually say, as someone who's read a fair bit of political and historical counterfactual essays, but also quite a bit of counterfactual fiction, which we'll be talking about a bit more in the second half of the podcast. There's nothing more frustrating than when you read a work where you can see that the general idea has been put forward, but the author, even if they haven't made it super explicit, it's clear from the piece that the author hasn't worked that out in their own head.
Absolutely.
Because I've read a few of those in the future, and I've read a few of those in the past, and they can be quite frustrating for the reader as well. Because if you kind of generally know the topic, you can read one where it's like, oh, and I don't know, Howard Hughes was president, and it's like, and it goes to your in your head, you're trying to work in what circumstances, and and if the story doesn't make it clear at some point, it can be it can really go around your head.
Yes, and I mean sometimes. There is an obvious butterfly effect, and if you go far enough into the future, then I think you can probably be more excused for changing things, because you can sort of hand wave it away by saying, well, enough other things had changed, that circumstances that we really don't need to get into had altered to a sufficient extent that it had butterflied out to some perhaps potentially unexpected consequence. You can do something like that.
Well, and it can be funny as well, can't you? There's that famous Simpsons episode that everyone was quoting for the last few years where, they predicted in circa 2002 that President Trump would happen, and that's a funny throwaway gag. You don't, to enjoy that, you don't need to know the exact chain of events that led to all that. And of course, the Simpsons writers couldn't, but it's a funny joke, and as it turned out, a very plausible one. So yeah, no, I think that perfectly explains what a point of divergence is. And I mean, how did you? That's kind of exactitude, that you believe creates a better counterfactual. Do you feel like? I suppose in a sense, because the Eric Joyce theory, so to speak, is a bit of a pop, political nerd, pop culture talking point. You kind of had your point of divergence there, didn't you? In a sense, but the way you chose to emphasize it is interesting.
Yes, exactly, and this is probably the best example of a clear. And more importantly, a plausible point of divergence that I've ever seen in any potential scenario for an alternative history. Because, I mean, think about it, David. I don't know about you, but as far as I know, most people's success rate in not punching someone in a pub is 100%.
Yes.
It's not implausible to say maybe a guy who started punching people in a pub didn't do that. You can't say, well, that would never have happened. Most people can manage that, and in fact do every time they go out.
But I suppose also the way you frame it in your essay, you kind of have the essay introduced with, kind of like the interior monologue almost of Eric Joyce, or at least an insight into his thinking. And for anyone who's been on a night out equally, it's a very relatable counterfactual is should I have one more drink or shouldn't I,
Yes, and I thought that was an important thing to do, because we have to bear in mind that the circumstances that Eric Joyce was in at that period in life that led him to behave as he did on that particular night would not automatically have disappeared purely because he had not thrown those punches in that pub on that night, as it were. I felt that what I needed to do was to present a scenario where not only does he just not have that particular fight, but the experience of getting so close to having it, and the realization that he had got as close as he did to it, was enough to make him avoid and actually actively choose to change his behaviour to ensure that he would avoid any similar event happening in the future. So what I'm seeing when I look at Eric Joyce in that period of his life, and sad to say, as in reality it developed thereafter, is someone who was on something of a downward spiral, and it was, again sad to say, apparently closely related to his alcohol consumption. So I didn't think it was enough to say he just didn't have that fight. It had to be a watershed moment for him, and so that's what I chose to present in what I was writing there.
Would you like to explain, I suppose in the immediate terms there, what happened to Eric Joyce and by extension to his parliamentary seat?
Absolutely. Well, the main thing that happened to Eric Joyce was that his political career was immediately over. He didn't take the course that some other people may have taken in his situation in resigning, but he was expelled from the Labour Party, and it was obvious that this wasn't going to be one of those expulsions that, you know, has an investigation that goes on for a period of time, and then a suspension is lifted or there's a readmittance. That was never going to be on the cards in the case of an MP who had assaulted other MPs in the House of Commons. As far as the Labour Party was concerned, that was it. So what they needed to do was to get a new candidate for Falkirk in the next following general election, which of course was what became the 2015 general election. And so at first it was just another selection contest, but then things started to go a trifle wrong. Now, I have obviously, in preparation for writing this article, done fairly extensive research into what actually happened in terms of the Falkirk Labour selection. But it is true that to this day there is a dispute among factions within the Labour Party as to what happened.
I will hear no such thing, David.
Surely not. What we know, let's just stick to what we know. There was apparently an attempt by the trade union known as Unite, which is, you know, if you're going to look at trade unions with influence in the Labour Party, that's pretty much up there. It's the trade union that Len McCluskey ran, for example.
And of course they're currently undergoing a leadership election as we record this.
Yes, indeed, that's true, and we don't know yet who's going to be succeeding Len McCluskey, but you know, anybody who remembers pretty much anything about that period of politics will know that Len McCluskey was a figure who loomed large in the Labour movement, and by extension, the Unite Union that he led was... I think you would struggle to point to another trade union that was more influential within the Labour Party within that period. And it seems that members of the local Unite branch had made an attempt to try to influence the candidate selection in such a way as to have a friendly candidate be the person who was selected. And I talk in the essay to some degree about some of the allegations as to what actually happened. But again, for the purposes of this podcast, sticking strictly to what we know, there was a scandal that emerged about it because it had been alleged that the influence that Unite was attempting to bring to bear on that selection contest was not entirely proper. And as a result of this scandal, which made national news, it prompted the then leader of the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, to announce a review of all matters concerning the relationship between trade unions in general and the Labour Party. And so we had the review. It was headed by Ray Collins, a former General Secretary of the Labour Party, and by profession, by career, a trade unionist himself. And the results of that review are said by a lot of people to have been what permitted the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. And I've no doubt you're going to want to ask me a bit more about that too.
Yes, I am. I can say, as someone who's a Labour Party member myself, I'm well aware that those rules pertain to this day. We're still operating under those
indeed,
rules.
Yes.
Would you just like to firstly just tell our readers who might not be aware how the rules changed in 2014, I guess it would be?
Thank you. Yes, and I think for anyone who's interested in politics from the more academic side or political science, if we want to get grandiose about it, this is perhaps the point in what I've written that they may find themselves most interested in. Because the conventional wisdom about this so-called Eric Joyce theory has it that the key difference that was made in the Collins Review and in the rule changes that resulted from it was the introduction of a new category of voting members in Labour leadership elections. As you will be well aware, David, the rule change made it possible for any member of the general public who was not a member of any other political party to pay the party £3 and become what was known, and indeed what is still known, I think, as a registered supporter. And what I could most liken it to, for anyone who's at all familiar with American politics, in the US, party membership is pretty small, as in, you don't find many people who are actual members of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. What you do find, though, is a lot of people who are registered supporters of either of those parties. And in most of the states, if you want to be voting in one of their primary elections for, whether it be for a House candidate or a Senate candidate or a presidential candidate, in order to vote in that party's primary, in most states, and it does differ from state to state, but in most cases you have to be a registered supporter of one party or the other. And I think that what Collins was trying to do with the registered supporters was almost to create a system that was analogous to that, where you were involving people who were interested enough in the Labour Party to want to pay a nominal fee to become a registered supporter, but not interested enough to become a party member, which might imply expectations that you would start to become an activist and things like that. So it was an attempt to bring more of a mass membership effect to the Labour Party. And so, tying it back to what we're talking about here, the conventional wisdom is that this was decisive in electing Jeremy Corbyn, because it allowed a lot of people who were on the far left to join up as registered supporters, pay their £3, which I think we can agree £3 is nominal for something of this nature, and then vote for Jeremy Corbyn as leader, and that was what determined him getting to become Labour leader, winning the election. And so what I found, and this actually, when I pitched the piece to Biteback before I even started writing the thing, the main challenge that came back to me was, well, you're just flat wrong. Because if you look at the statistics, if you look at the actual numbers in terms of Jeremy Corbyn's election as leader of the Labour Party, yes, of course, he walked the registered supporters category, but he also walked the other membership categories. He walked the Labour Party full members category, and he certainly walked the trade unionists category. So, how can you say that this £3 membership category was decisive when the numbers tell us that it obviously wasn't? And that seemed like a pretty fundamental challenge. And it seemed, for me at least, for a time, as though it might have been the decisive death knell for this Eric Joyce theory. However, it overlooks a few things. Primarily, it overlooks the fact that the Collins Review and the reforms that were brought in as a result of it had two other key effects aside from the £3 registered supporters category. The first of these was that it changed the position of trade unionists who were also supportive of the Labour Party. Previously, anybody who had been a member of a trade union that institutionally was affiliated to the Labour Party automatically had a vote in a Labour leadership election. After the Collins reforms, only people who had specifically opted in to being represented by the Labour Party would have the option to do that. So that was one of the changes. But the other one that I think was really very significant, and I think probably may very well have been decisive in a world where Jeremy Corbyn had been on the ballot under the old rules. And, well, in my story, that's not quite what happened. But if it had been what happened, you would have to consider that the Labour Party completely reformed the way that it did leadership elections, root and branch. Even if you completely ignore the constituencies, the actual people, the people on the ground who had votes, if you can ignore that completely, because it restructured the whole thing. Under the old set of rules, the rules that everyone from Tony Blair to Ed Miliband had been elected under, the Labour Party operated a form of electoral college. And this electoral college had 3 sections within it. One section was members of the Labour Party. Another section was affiliated members. So this consisted of the trade unionists who were members of a trade union that was institutionally affiliated to the Labour Party, and that was the vast bulk of them. There were a few others, so members of some of the affiliated socialist societies, the classic one, the most well-known one certainly being the Fabian Society. So that was section 2. Section number 3, though, was the MPs and MEPs who were elected members of the Labour Party. There were, I think, and I would have to go back and check the exact number. It's probably not worth it. I think the number was 282.
Would you like to explain to our listeners what an MEP was? No, I'm just kidding with that.
The European Parliament, I'm told at least, still exists, but there are
as of this recording.
Of this recording, however, there are no longer any members of the UK Labour Party sitting there, and I'll leave it to individual listeners to form their own views as to the propriety or otherwise of that state of affairs.
Very wise of you, David.
But the point is that these 3 sections, each of them was made equal by the process. Now this might sound insane. And, you were a member of the Labour Party at the time, so if somebody's going to defend this point of view, then it should probably be you rather than me.
Well, actually, I won't get into my biography too much, but I'm a member of the Labour Party, but I've only been a member of the Labour Party since about April 2017.
Yes, indeed. So, you joined the Labour Party under Corbyn's leadership, so that
I did.
That potentially could present other questions, but
sure, yeah. I've to date voted in one Labour leadership election, which is the one that elected Keir Starmer quite recently. So, for the record,
so you will never have voted under those older rules.
No, that's true.
But if the Collins report and the Collins reforms had never happened, then of course you would have been voting, all other things being equal, shall we say, you would have been voting under those former set of rules. But the reason why this is so significant is that essentially, of these 3 sections of the Labour electorate, or selectorate, if you want to put it that way, you had party members, you had trade unionists and affiliated society members, and you had MPs and MEPs. But what they would do, once all of these people had voted, was you would take those 3 individual sections and you would do some mathematics that would mean that the overall result of each of those sections was weighted equally in terms of the overall result that you ended up getting. Now, I've tried my best in what I was writing to explain this in a way that would be accessible to the average reader, and it was a challenge. And I can't tell you how many drafts I went through before I came up with something that was comprehensible.
I actually remember sitting with my mum watching BBC News 24 back in 2010, it would have been, watching Ed Miliband get elected to Labour leader, at the conference. And they were the results were coming up on some sort of PowerPoint or something like that, as they came in. And I think me and mum turned to each other and were just like, what's happening now? Like, who's winning? Because obviously that was an extremely tight race as well, but it was baffling at the best of times.
Yes, apparently somebody is winning, but it's difficult to tell precisely who or why.
Yeah, exactly.
And so my theory was, and my theory has been, that actually people have got the Eric Joyce theory wrong when they assume that the main significant change that had been made by the Collins reform was this introduction of the £3 membership category. Actually, a lot more significant was the fact that at the time of what was in real life Jeremy Corbyn's election as leader, he had virtually no support among the Parliamentary Labour Party or their MEPs. I say virtually no. It was a shambles, the process that led to him being even allowed on the ballot, because, in order to get on the ballot, he needed to have a certain number of constituency branches backing him, which, he was the left candidate, that was going to be assured. But he also needed to have a threshold that he would have to meet of support from within the Parliamentary Labour Party. And that's where I actually managed to insert myself into my own story.
Yes, I did notice that, actually, even before you confirmed it in the footnotes.
Yes. Where it just so happens that my office, where I was working at that time, was, well, I want to say next to the Parliamentary Labour Party. It actually overlapped the office of the Parliamentary Labour Party for a good few feet. And so where all of those Labour MPs who were coming in to nominate their candidate had to be standing about chatting to one another, well, that was right in front of me. I was literally sitting there watching them having those conversations. And it was touch and go whether Jeremy Corbyn was ever going to get on that ballot at all. And so, when you consider a situation like that, it is obvious that he would have had severely limited support in that one of the three sections of the Labour leadership selectorate. And so, in order to win the leadership at all, he would have had to carry the other two sections by a far wider margin than he actually did in reality. And that's before you even consider the other changes that the Collins Review made, which included there being no £3 members and there being, potentially more moderate trade unionists voting in the election. It's a complicated piece of political science, of political history, as to, do we really believe it's plausible that under the old rules Jeremy Corbyn would not have won the leadership of the Labour Party at that time? And I do go into those questions, but I also did take a bit of a shortcut in that I have Jeremy Corbyn deciding not to stand for the leadership, and so somebody else stands instead, and that results in an altered contest.
Yeah. I was going to touch on that. I want to move on in a second because I want to talk to you about one of your other pieces of work, and also because, as I say, we want to be a little bit coy about the outcome of your essay, just so people buying the book, could enjoy it fresh. But as you've already let listeners know that in your treatment of this, Jeremy Corbyn doesn't stand and thus doesn't win the Labour leadership in 2015. You obviously have a different candidate emerging victorious, and obviously people can imagine if there was a different leader of the Labour Party elected in 2015, with the Brexit referendum happening the next year. Several things that you talked before about, the sort of cliche of the butterfly flapping its wings. It's not going to take too long for those winds to turn hurricane, is it? With, as I say, whilst maintaining that sort of like veneer of coyness, would you like to just briefly touch on, I suppose, the points about Brexit and the sorts of attendant events that you wanted to make?
I felt that it was important for this piece to be what I ultimately wanted it to be, that we go through the Eric Joyce theory in full. And the Eric Joyce theory has certain things assumed within it. It has, number one, Jeremy Corbyn does not become the leader of the Labour Party. Number two, the EU referendum, while it proceeds as it does in history, it's not stopped in some way. The EU referendum fails, and we do not leave the EU. Number three, some other things happen between the result of the referendum and where I chose to end the story, which was at the dawn of the new decade. So we actually end up stopping, well, sometime around the end of 2019. So that is a spoiler. And I think that it is reasonable to spoil the outcome of the EU referendum in my story, because I think the entire point of what I was trying to write was that I wanted to give something that I didn't feel existed up until that point, which is a definitive account with full analysis of the Eric Joyce theory. And that does involve a lot of changes. The conventional wisdom has it that Eric Joyce punching someone in a pub results in Brexit. So if you're going to test that theory, to steelman it, you have to present the option where he doesn't punch them and we don't leave the EU. So around the EU referendum, a lot of things do change. And of course, the only thing that we can really tie it to out of this story is a different leader of the Labour Party. Now, one thing I'm not going to spoil is who I have winning that Labour leadership election. What I will say, though, is that the person who, in my story, wins would, in reality, subsequently become one of the most fervent and most truculent and most difficult opponents of Brexit that the government ever faced in its subsequent attempts to deliver Brexit, particularly under Theresa May, who, of course, in my story, never becomes Prime Minister.
Yes, there's some interesting, as I say, we won't get into it, but there's interesting mentions of, knock-on effects for the Tories in your essay. Obviously, less time to treat the Lib Dems and UKIP, although I found one of your late mentions of UKIP so tantalising again, because as with any narrative, obviously, part of the art is what you leave out, and I found myself wanting to sort of shake you by the shoulders and be like, what happened to UKIP, in this reality, what happened, what exactly happened, although obviously you nicely hinted at it. I think we've tantalised people enough with that. I should say we're not getting paid by Biteback, by the way. Well, David hopefully is.
No, I'm not. I'm not getting a red cent out of this. I can assure you. I will get my author's copies. But, consider there are, I think, 22 chapters in this book. If they were to, I'd love to see the businessman who can develop a business model for publishing a book where you pay royalties to 22 different people and still manage to meet your own costs. So no, I get 5 authors' copies, and I also retain copyright over the piece.
I was too polite to ask you any of this, David, but I'm glad that you volunteered it.
And it's true for we're about to start talking, I think, about the essay I had in a previous volume. But it remains true for that. I retain the copyright on it, but I don't get royalties. I don't get paid for this at all. It's a passion project, you could call it.
Straight from the author's mouth. I should say I'm certainly not getting anything out of Biteback, but I would. It's kind of that old thing, isn't it? If I only promote things that you actually have enjoyed as products, and I own all of these books. I've pre-ordered the new one, and I've found loads to enjoy in them. We don't have the time to talk about all of the essays, or a fraction of them today.
Well, before we conclude, let me surprise you with a question. What did you think about what I wrote? Did you actually enjoy it, or are you being polite here?
Well, I'd never tell you, honestly, would I? I mean, no, as the polite host that I am. No, I did. I did enjoy it. I mean, partly because I am, so interested in the minutiae of party management and the knock-on effects of it. And obviously, it's a period of history we all lived through. It's a period of history I've been politically involved in, first as a Lib Dem member and then as a Labour member. There's, as you say, you end the narrative at the sort of beginning of 2020, and it's kind of living as we are through this phase of COVID. I don't want to say late COVID, but whatever phase of this we are going through, it's kind of interesting to cast your mind back to the turbulence of the 2010s and how much did happen and how much of it could have gone differently, whether from an Eric Joyce divergence point or anything grander, but I really enjoyed it, and I thought you did very well to as I say, to present quite grand sweeping changes, but keep it quite succinct and leave enough to the reader's imagination without leaving them frustrated, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear that you felt that I did that. I certainly hope to do it. It was a slightly unconventional format that I adopted in this because, often you have a sort of a within the genre, you tend to have two basic formats. Number one is you write a pure story, so it's just, this is the story of the world in this alternative reality, and, that's what you get. Or, on the other hand, you get something that can be fairly dry sort of essay, where you just analyse each of the points in turn. Well, what I tried to do was to combine the two. So, the chapter alternates between sections of story, where we relate what's happening in the alternative world, and sections of analysis, where we look back on the previous section and we try to test it for credibility. Is what we've just presented reasonable? Is it a scenario that makes sense? Is it something that we should believe in? And what factors should we take into consideration when forming a view as to how credible we think that this scenario that we proposed is?
I think one thing I really enjoy about these essays in general, in this book and similar collections I own and have read over the last few years, is I like teasing out what the essays say about the biases of the authors. And because I know you and know a bit about not all the details, but I know kind of the general slant of your politics and some of your opinions and that sort of stuff. I suppose this didn't have the massive surprises for me that some of them have, because some of the essays in these books I've read, whether or not they're capable essays or whatever, I've read them and gone, wow, you could really tell what the author thinks here. I think yours was more light touch than that, but there were interesting, as someone who knows you a bit, there was like interesting little bits and hints of maybe viewpoints or people that you might have admiration for, or maybe contempt for, that kind of teased through at times. And I think sometimes that's maybe subconscious, and sometimes it's you deliberately doing it, And I think that's actually, I'd recommend these books to anyone who wants to do that, because it can actually be quite extreme in some examples. You really get what people think of these figures in some of these essays.
Yes, I too have read most of the. I won't say that I've read every piece that's been in all of the Biteback volumes. I probably read most of them, though. In fact, I'm certain I've read most of them. And I know exactly what you're saying about this, because some of them, and I think it is deliberate. I think it's a stylistic choice in most cases as to how much of your own political viewpoint you want to present. And I think part of that will naturally relate to what you're trying to achieve in writing the thing. There's, for example, in Prime Minister Corbyn, there are two potential scenarios relating to a Jeremy Corbyn leadership.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought these ones up, actually.
Yeah, and one of them is from somebody who is clearly quite supportive, and the other is from someone who's clearly quite opposed. And I wasn't involved in that particular volume of the book, but I can only assume that the editorial team will have been in conversation with both of these authors, and they'd have agreed between themselves. We've got people with alternative perspectives, so we're going to use that as a plus, and we're going to have one that's supportive and one that's opposed, and it's there's an extent to which you're broadening out your audience appeal there, or just your general interest for the average reader, we would hope.
Oh, definitely, and to an extent, balance as well. And yeah, I should say both. A lot of these essays are very amusing as well. That's another thing that people don't say about counterfactual political history, is it often is pretty funny if you know where the divergence happens, what point the author's trying to make with it. Little in jokes, things like that.
Yes, indeed. And I think the most fertile territory for in jokes in counterfactual history is where you sort of ironically point, or sort of, shall we say, provide shadows or reflections of events that happened in real history. So, you talk about how you on occasion saw shades of my own views on things. You may have noticed I made a joke about Sir Keir Starmer at one point that comes in.
Yes, I did notice that. Yeah. Well, it's little things like that humanise the author, don't they? Whether you know them or not. It's nice to have that little input occasionally, the sort of glimpse behind the curtain. Anyway, we should move on because I do want to chat to you a little bit about the previous essay that you wrote for one of the other volumes.
Yes.
But I just as I say, we're not being paid, but I'll just make it clear that as we record Prime Minister Priti and Other Things That Never Happened by Biteback Publishing, this is edited by Duncan Brack and Ian Dale. It's on pre-order now, but it's due out at the moment on 27th of July 2021. So if anyone's interested, you can go to Biteback website. Have a look.
Yes, that's right. I can tell people that I think we are expecting a relatively wide distribution of this in bookshops. So while you can buy it directly from the publisher at bitebackpublishing.com, it's available, by the way, in hardback and on ebook. You can also, hopefully at least, get it in your local bookshop, and it will be on the Kindle from day one.
Thank you very much. And I should say this David's essay is one of 23 essays in it, apparently. So that's I think you're getting your money's worth out of that.
When Senator Clinton or President Clinton asserts that I said that the Republicans had better economic policies since 1980, that is not the case.
It is sometimes difficult to understand what Senator Obama has said because as soon as he is confronted on it, he says that's not what he meant. The facts are that he has said in the last week that he really liked the ideas of the Republicans over the last 10 to 15 years.
That is not true. What I said, and I will provide you with a quote, what I said is that Ronald Reagan was a transformative political figure because he was able to get Democrats to vote against their economic interests to form a majority to push through their agenda, an agenda that I objected to because while I was working on those streets, watching those folks see their jobs shipped overseas, you were a corporate lawyer sitting on the board of Walmart. I was fighting these fights.
You talked about Ronald Reagan being a transformative political leader. I did not mention his name.
Your husband did.
Well, I'm here. He's not.
Okay, well, I can't tell who I'm running against sometimes.
I think we both have very passionate and committed spouses who stand up for us, and I'm proud of that. But you also talked about the Republicans having ideas over the last 10 to 15 years.
I didn't say they were good ones.
Well, you can read the context of it.
Well,
it certainly
I didn't
came
say
across.
They were good ones.
Well, it certainly came across in the way that it was presented as though the Republicans had been standing up against the conventional wisdom with their ideas. I'm just reacting to the fact, yes, they did have ideas, and they were bad ideas, bad for America. And I was fighting against those ideas when you were practicing law and representing your contributor, Resco, in his slum landlord business in inner city Chicago.
Actually, in this half, David, just before we kind of move on to talking about sort of counterfactual, more general, especially its use in sort of fiction, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about your previous essay because this I don't know if this was your first, the essay I'm about to talk about was your first ever piece of counterfactual fiction, but you can shed some light on that.
It was, yes.
Was it? So this is the one in the Biteback collection that came out in 2011. That we referred to tangentially before, which was the Prime Minister Boris and Other Things That Never Happened.
Yes.
So I mean, I read this one. I think I got this when it was still fairly recent, maybe in 2012, something like that. And I was still becoming the political nerd I am today, but I was well on the way. We're obviously talking about the sort of mid-coalition years at this point. Would you like to tell us? What that essay, what the title of that essay is, and the sort of story behind you writing it.
The title for the 2011 essay was "What if Hillary Clinton had secured the Democratic nomination in 2008?" And this, well, essentially was my introduction to writing alternative history. I've only done these two works, at least seriously. I mean, there have obviously been a great many other scenarios that I have considered, and in some cases, maybe begun a bit of conjectural work on, but never fully developed into anything that was going to be fit for any form of public consumption. But the history behind this, I think, I had been interested in alternative history and counterfactual history, and we can potentially get into what we would consider to be the distinctions between those two terms. It's pretty fine, but in some cases it may be relevant. Since I was a teenager, and the first time that I ever attempted to write anything in the genre was for a magazine, an online magazine that a friend of mine published. But it had a readership somewhere approaching zero, as far as I can work out, because it had a pretty strange distribution model. Essentially, it would be emailed as an attached application that people would then read. And I started out on this thing as a columnist, but I had this idea, having quite clearly lived through and followed extremely closely the presidential election that ultimately in history would lead to Barack Obama's election as President of the United States of America. But especially I was fascinated by the Democratic primary, because you had this almost titanic battle between two political figures. You had on the one side Barack Obama, who was the coming man in every sense. And on the other side you had the, severely accomplished politician in her own right as a senator, but also the former First Lady of the United States of America in Hillary Clinton. And so this was a scenario that was fascinating to me at the time, and I followed it extremely closely. And so not too long after the result happened, I wrote up a short story for this online magazine, and it was published there. Not too long after that, it was certainly at least after the election had happened, I used to be a reader of Ian Dale's blog. And Ian Dale, a name I'm sure will be familiar to a lot of listeners. He basically owns Biteback Publishing.
Yeah.
And he's also a very well-known media personality in his own right. Obviously, particularly well-known for his slots on LBC. But he was, at that time, best known among politicos for his blog. And I was a regular reader. I read it every day. And on one of these days, I happened to notice that he put out a post that said, "We at Biteback Publishing are going to be producing a new volume of alternative history." And, as you mentioned, there had been, at that time, 2 volumes previously. Prime Minister Portillo and President Gore. But I'd written this in a very, very shortened form. But I emailed Ian directly and I said, I've got an idea. I would like to write something about, not about what if there had been a different result in the presidential election, but what if there'd been a different result in the Democratic primaries. The response I got was, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. How about you write it? So I thought, well, okay then. I've kind of done a lot of the thinking for this other article, and I'm not going to say that none of the text from that original article made it into what was eventually published. I think perhaps a bit of it did, but it was greatly expanded. And I sent it to Biteback, and, my feeling was, okay, so I'm writing this as an exercise. They're going to have umpteen billion submissions from all sorts of people, almost all of whom will be 100 times more important or significant or have name recognition more than me. And I will have done an exercise that will have been valuable to me, and that will be how it ends. But for whatever reason, they decided to crack on. I kept getting emails back from them suggesting that they were moving it to the next stage of publication. And we got to the point at some stage where I thought, are they actually going to stick this thing in a book? I mean, is this serious? And I certainly, by the way, I certainly don't say that the result was any great shake. So I don't hate the piece when I read it back, but I certainly don't love it. I can say that much.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, it is actually, and I'm really not trying to flatter you here, but it is amongst my favourites in the Biteback collections thus far, and I think it's got a lot of character. and it's obviously about a very interesting subject. But also, and we'll get onto this, but it's also, and I've told you this, to your face, but I think it's aged very well in some of the points and perceptions it has given 2016, because obviously we're talking about Hillary Clinton quite a lot in this essay, and so obviously her political story was not over.
No, indeed.
I'm not going to spoil this essay thoroughly either, because it's still available. You can pick it up, either from Biteback or secondhand or whatever, and it's even though it's 10 years old now. But I'm going to mention some of the things that happened, because obviously you have, for various reasons that are a bit too wonkish to go into now, you have Hillary Clinton winning the Democratic nomination in 2008 over Obama, and you deal with some of the sort of reverberations and knock-ons of that, and how they would affect Democratic Party morale and unity and all that kind of stuff. But then you have how that campaign against John McCain, you have John McCain as the Republican nominee.
Yes, indeed.
As in the actual timeline. You go into a bit of that, and I think one of the ways in which it's a very interesting read, when it came out, but also post 2016, is that you have quite interesting things to say, and I think probably quite dead on things about the strengths, because they are there, but also weaknesses and vulnerabilities of a Clinton campaign.
Yeah.
Obviously you said in 2008, but some of these seem to shake out a bit in 2016, shall we say. I mean, was that weird for you when 2016 rolled around, kind of revisiting it,
I had a difficult time in 2016 because as you know, I'm a conservative. But I desperately hoped that Hillary Clinton would win that presidential election on the sole grounds that I believed that Donald Trump was of a character that did not deserve to hold that office, which, as a huge fan and friend of the United States of America, I felt was of too exalted a status to merit a person with his character to hold. And that's a difficult thing for me to say, because, I would have supported pretty much any other generic Republican in winning that election over Hillary Clinton. And I mean, some people, like if you listen to Raheem Kassam's speeches, for example, he says that the attitude that the US Republicans today should take towards never-Trumpers is they should kick them out. Well, I mean, if that's your electoral strategy, then good luck. I'm not sure that it's the one that I would necessarily suggest that they follow, even if they are enthusiastic still about Trump and his past. Yes, it was difficult, because I didn't only hope, I also expected Clinton to beat him, as most people did. I think that there have been certain facts about that campaign that have come out subsequently that reveal where we erred in this. I mean, one of them, and I don't know whether this will even make the cut for the podcast, but you might be interested, David, to hear that, or you may already know, that there was an exercise that was done by an academic institution where they sex swapped the two candidates, and they employed actors who were of the opposite sex from Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton to replay the debates, because their expectation, of course, was that everybody would immediately go for the Hillary Clinton character in the debates, because, the only reason why they didn't was that she was a woman, and they were all being sexist in their judgment of how it had gone on. Well, actually, the complete reverse happened. What you saw was that the male version of Hillary Clinton was pretty much dismissed, and the female version of Donald Trump was loved and embraced by the focus groups that they brought in to look at this stuff. So
it was the attitude, and to an extent the content was, for a neutral term, popular enough to override any sexist factors, shall we say.
It was not only popular, but it was about the connection that was being made with voters and with their real concerns. And I think that's what is so often ignored by the political scientists, the advisors, all of this sort of thing. They are missing out on a great extent of the human element, and they tend to cover their failures in this regard by using terms such as populist when they're talking about the people who actually succeed in these regards, and they sort of dismiss it as though it were something that's it's not a recommendation. It's a condemnation, if it's anything at all.
Yeah. I think populist has become overused to the point of uselessness now. Really, I mean, I know it has some more technical definitions, from political scientists and things, but I think in the modern political discourse on both sides of the Atlantic, I think it's a term we need to drop for a while, basically.
Well, I would agree with you there, and I think especially if it's used as a term of abuse for people who actually manage to succeed in achieving some measure of popular support. One would hope that in a democracy that would be seen as a good thing.
Yeah, I'd agree to an extent that it's come to lazily stand in for election winner in a kind of resentful way in some ways, and obviously, as I say, a lot of people listening know there are more technical and sort of wonkish definitions of populism, but I'm not discounting those. But yeah, I mean, I don't, again, as I say, I won't spoil where your essay goes, or at least where it ends up with regards to the 2008 election. I did have a quick question actually, because I was sort of doing a bit of date checking, and I was again, without spoiling the big stuff, in your alternative version of events, John McCain ends up picking Mitt Romney as his vice presidential running mate.
Yes.
That's interesting because in 2000, you're writing that presumably in, or at least expanding on this idea in 2010-11, when presumably not many British people, I mean, I know you're a politics enthusiast, but not many of the British public generally would have even heard of Mitt Romney at this stage. I know he'd been a previous candidate, in the campaigns and stuff. I mean, was there any reason? Yeah, I mean, obviously there are reasons. Could you summarize why you picked him and why your McCain picked him?
Oh, absolutely. Well, before we even get to that part of the question, I can tell you something that you are probably not going to believe, which is that I had picked Sarah Palin as John McCain's nominee, apparently, and I've looked at the calendar dates at this, apparently before her name had even been presented to John McCain himself. So
bragging rights there, David, I think.
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily an attempt to brag as much as it is to say that there are patterns of history and politics that it is possible to predict if you are looking closely enough at the events that they concern. So why I picked Mitt Romney? Well, yes, it's true that there may have been a lot of the general audience in the UK at that time that wouldn't have known about him. Anyone who was following it closely knew very well that he was the number 2 in that contest. So what we have to look at is why, in reality, did John McCain pick Sarah Palin? And above anything else, the answer is that she was a woman. And so what John McCain was trying to do was to identify that section of the American populace whose number one issue was, I want a woman on the ballot. And because Barack Obama had beaten Hillary Clinton, for that demographic was something that potentially, at least from McCain's point of view, that could have been something that could be used against the Democratic Party in that election. And you have to bear in mind, I mean, particularly in the context that they were going in with, the Republicans were on the back foot. So John McCain obviously knew that he was going to be looking for some sort of advantage. And in seeing this contest, this battle between Clinton and Obama, and seeing Clinton lose, it's natural in his position to think, well, okay, maybe there is in fact a demographic that just wants a woman on the ticket. And so what I'll do is I'll give them a woman on the ticket. So in my scenario, of course, that never arises because Clinton, as a woman, is nominated for the Democratic side. So it's not an advantage that John McCain can seek to make. So what he does is he looks for the most credible Republican ticket partner, and he selects Mitt Romney because, well, I think he pretty much would have been. I think that Mitt Romney mitigated a lot of the disadvantages that John McCain's candidacy had. He was a young man. He was a man who had a lot of experience in, particularly in financial policy. And this, again, you go back to the situation as it existed at that time. We were hitting Bear Stearns. We were hitting Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. We were hitting the entire set of situations that led to the financial crisis, the credit crunch. And I think Mitt Romney was a guy who had a lot of good story to tell on that.
Well, it's interesting actually. That's one of the few bits. I'm not going to spend time critiquing your 10-year-plus-year-old writing
right.
or judgments. But that's actually one of those interesting things where I think I might disagree with you. But only and actually in some ways similar to we were talking about the 2016 campaign. In some ways drawing on how the 2012 campaign went, I suppose you can set up really plausible points of divergence, can't you, and plausible alternative political choices. What you maybe can't, and I don't mean you personally, what one can't necessarily do with any certainty is say how the public would have reacted to certain choices.
Yes, exactly.
Because that's a very mutable beast, isn't it? And I think I won't spoil the effect that the Romney vice presidency nomination has on the race for readers of it. But I think where you zig, I might zag. If you see what I mean. But I think they're probably equally valid prognostications, if you see what I mean.
Well, is there anything in particular that strikes you as being out of kilter with what you'd have assumed?
Well, I suppose where you think Romney might be a boost, I think he might be a drag. Shall we say, without getting too, but for all the same qualities that you describe.
Yeah,
if you see what I mean. You don't misdescribe a 2008 Romney.
I can see that too. My only view is I think that we all have to consider the effect of presentation within politics. And so what I was trying to suggest was that under the circumstances he found himself in, I think that Mitt Romney was a competent enough politician. And in fact, John McCain was too, in ultimately managing the campaign and partly helping shape the image of his running mate, to try to make it look as though Romney's background was actually a positive, and to sort of shape that aspect of the campaign, particularly when you face it against what the Democrats would have been doing in that situation with a Hillary Clinton who, and getting back to why you say that you think that this piece was potentially quite prescient in light of what happened in 2016, I just don't think she was all that hot a campaigner,
Yeah,
that's the big thing, and that's what it ultimately comes down to. I just don't think Hillary Clinton turns out to have been all that good a politician.
Yeah, well, and I remember thinking this in 2015-16. It became clear that she was probably going to be the nominee in 2016. I was just like, how do people get more than one shot at this? And in a country of nearly 300 million people, I was just like, this is ridiculous. And I should say that runs across most of my politics. Actually, I just think more people need to crack at the whip, essentially, and that kind of that's free of party bias. I just think that generally should happen.
And I suppose you could make an argument to say that Barack Obama was the man with, in Tony Blair's words, the hand of history on his shoulder, and Hillary Clinton just wasn't at that time. Mm-hmm. But she didn't really do the things that she would have needed to do to prove that she was the woman with the hand of history on her shoulder at the time when it would have made the difference.
Yeah, and very unfortunate for someone to do that twice, or not do it twice. Well, we'll leave that there, David. But I would encourage people to check that out. And it's a fun essay and very well written, and I enjoyed it. I mean, I've too modest to say, obviously, but I've had a bit. I'm not published like yourself, twice published, soon to be. But I wrote a little alternative political fiction thing online. It's ages ago now. I think it was 2014. It was serial. It was the 3-part thing, so it was slightly serialized, but it was basically tail end of 2014, beginning of 2015, and it was published on Lib Dem Voice. I was a Lib Dem member then, still at the time, and it was about. Well, I'm going to ask you if you remember. Do you remember Douglas Carswell?
Well, of course. He's one of the most prominent politicians in Missouri.
Oh God, yeah, I'd had seen something about that. Can't quite let go of him, No, I mean, he, for people who don't remember, Douglas Carswell was one of the Conservative MPs who, in the 2010 to 15 Parliament, eventually ended up as a UKIP defector, and actually, I think the only UKIP MP to then be elected at the general election in 2015, wasn't he?
I believe that's right. Yes.
Yeah, this was a sort of fun frippery that I wrote at the time then about, because Douglas Carswell, when he defected to the UKIP, had said something. This actually was a quote from him where he'd said something about toying with the idea of becoming an independent liberal, like running under that banner instead, to achieve some of the same aims, obviously, because he's a noted Eurosceptic, and played a part in the Brexit referendum. As a Lib Dem at the time, I found that interesting. I found, I made quite a lot of hay with the ruptures he might have caused in the then extremely embattled, late coalition era Liberal Democrat Party, and it was good. It was a real fun experience, and the comments section was lively, and that this is certainly an era in my life. I mean, now I'm putting out podcasts and stuff, so I'm kind of less shy than I used to be, but it was kind of one of the first things I'd kind of put up online outside Facebook posts and stuff. So I remember being quite nervous about it at the time. Obviously it just got a Liberal Democrat audience, which is to say a small one, but it was good fun. So on my own small level, I kind of know the pleasures of the genre that you're working in.
I thought that it was excellent.
Oh, that's very nice of you.
Honestly, I read it at the time. I read it through, and I thought, yeah, this is absolutely plausible. I mean, one thing that I don't know how far you're interested in getting into the detail of the work, but
I'll tell you what, I'll put the link in the show notes,
yeah,
so people can make.
Because
I haven't read it for ages.
I wish you would, because I quite like to go back to it myself, and I think that one thing I'd be interested. I believe that you had Carswell forming a new party that was, I think, called, was it the Radical Liberal Party?
There was stuff going on. There was splinters. There was some. I think there were 2 splits, and there was something to do with, was it like David Laws and some of the other kind of Orange Book liberals ended up forming? Was it like the New Liberals or something like that? There was more than one thing going on in terms of the party rupturing. Put it that way.
Because you see, I kind of wondered. The one thing, well, no, I don't think I actually thought about it at the time. At the time, I absolutely loved it, and I bought it, pretty much 100%. When I think back, though, the one thing that I do think is there is such a thing as the Liberal Party, as in the Liberal Party that stayed as a continuing force from the merger between the Lib Dems and the SDP.
I'm geeky enough to know a fair bit about that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Misspent youth.
Well, of course, you will also know that the SDP continues to exist, just as the Liberal Party continues to exist. Well, I mean, you say bafflingly, but at this point, honestly, I reckon the SDP is probably doing better than the Liberal Party, really, because, they've got...
They got Patrick O'Flynn in the end,
exactly,
didn't they?
Yeah. So, yes, there was that. I was actually seriously tempted to vote for the SDP, because they were standing in the by-election in Tooting after Sadiq Khan was elected Mayor of London. Not because I have any interest in voting for the SDP, but just because I thought that should I be blessed with grandchildren, I might have the opportunity to tell them that I once voted for the SDP.
That's the true political nerd inside you speaking.
Yeah, exactly, which at my age is not something that one would consider feasible.
No, indeed, yeah. You didn't see Bootle, you were too young for that. As I say, I'll post the essay in the notes. The one thing I do remember is that in that essay, at some point, there's a Lib Dem leadership election. So this is kind of like an alternate universe where Nick Clegg actually gets toppled before the end of the coalition parliament. So
yes.
The Lib Dems reassert control, essentially. I think you can see at the time, as a Lib Dem member, I might have been having sort of fantasies in that direction. This is, again, this thing where, you betray your own biases, don't you, of course. But I do remember that it has Joe Swinson gaining control of the party in I guess like the beginning of 2015, which was kind of like the near future when it was written. And I was and it's weird because I was at a party event while still lived. I remember about, I don't know, 3 months later or something like that, and Joe Swinson rocked up, and I was like, because I think I'd had enough drinks. I was like, not Eric Joyce levels, but I'd had enough drinks. I was like, I wrote this thing that you were in, and she was like, really? I was like, yeah, you might have said. I really badly tried to explain it, and I just remember her looking, baffled, but like politely baffled, basically. But it's funny, given that Joe Swinson, I think most people consider not for the good of the party's fortunes, became leader. It's not saying in any way, I snagged that as a happening, but it was obviously she was considered a potential future leader in 2014 anyway. So it wasn't a particular get I had, but it was interesting.
It was a good call.
We'll take a short break, and then me and David are going to come back, and we're going to talk a little bit more about, as I say, counterfactuals and alternate history in the broader kind of fictional context. So we're going to talk about some of the stuff that got us into it, and some of the stuff that's kind of interesting to mention. It's by no means going to be exhaustive, but it hopefully will be quite a bit of fun. So see you in a sec.
I need more.
There is no more. I wish there were. I wish I could prove it, but I can't.
Then I can't ask them to go back.
You've got to.
And they will die moments after they return. How can I ask them to sacrifice themselves based solely on your intuition?
I don't know. But I do know that this is a mistake. Every fiber in my being says this is a mistake. I can't explain it to myself, so I can't explain it to you. I only know that I'm right.
Who is to say that this history is any less proper than the other?
I suppose I am.
Not good enough, damn it! Not good enough! I will not ask them to die.
40 billion people have already died. This war's not supposed to be happening. You've got to send those people back to correct this.
And what is the guarantee that if they go back, they will succeed? Every instinct is telling me this is wrong, it is dangerous, it is futile.
We've known each other a long time. You have never known me to impose myself on anyone, or take a stance based on trivial or whimsical perceptions. This timeline must not be allowed to continue. Now, I've told you what you must do. You have only your trust in me to help you decide to do it.
Welcome back. So, David, now that we've kind of talked about the essays and got the book promotion side out of the way, because it's very important stuff, I just kind of wanted to talk to you a bit more about the kind of, I suppose, the sort of wider scope of counterfactuals and alternate histories as they've kind of seeped into the pop culture and into the popular consciousness, and kind of more specifically, I suppose, how we became fascinated with them and what brought us to them. Would you like to say? I mean, you sort of started touching on that in the first half about what kind of got you hooked. I mean, as a kid. I mean, what were those kind of influences?
I can remember quite specifically the first time that I heard about counterfactual history as a concept. I was at school, and I would struggle to tell you my exact age. If I would guess I was around about 13 or 14, and this was in one of my history classes at school, and I had a good relationship with my history teacher at that time, and I think we must have been being taught about World War II, and I can remember going up to my teacher after class and saying to him something to the effect of, has anybody ever considered seriously what might have happened had all of this gone differently and had Germany actually won World War II? And his I can slightly remember his face sort of changed, and he said, yes, absolutely. In fact, there's a whole discipline devoted to questions such as that. It's called counterfactual history. And so he recommended to me, as a starting point, not as an example of the genre by any means, but as a starting point, he said, why don't you go away and read a book called Fatherland? And that's set in a world where Germany and Hitler win World War II. So I said, okay, I will do. And I did. And, sure enough, Fatherland, I don't know, are you familiar with it at all?
Is the Robert Harris novel, is it?
It was his first novel. He's now a great novelist. Well, at least an exceedingly popular novelist.
I just always get him mixed up with Thomas Harris, the Hannibal Lecter guy.
Yes, of course. Not to be confused, really, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But no, I've not. You know what? I've never read it, but I have seen. I think, was it a TV movie, or there was a movie adaptation of it that I've definitely seen, and so I know the broad outlines of the plot. And what it kind of plays with. Yeah.
Yes, there was a TV movie made of it. I don't believe I've ever actually seen the whole thing, but this is all 90s stuff, right? So. It's going back a while, and I know that I've seen clips of it, and I know it looks very 1990s. But the novel itself, well, I mean, if you're dealing with a historical theme, then it becomes automatically almost somewhat timeless. As in, a historical novel, unless there have been new facts or new analyses that have really come to be understood and to predominate, they're not going to change over time.
Although except as we mentioned with essays, of course, they always reveal more about the present than necessarily the period that they're writing about. Of course.
Well, yes, but then when it's something as far back as a World War II victory by Hitler, it's pretty clear that things are going to dovetail almost immediately to such a great extent that there's really not much you could do to give the lie to it over, after a couple of decades or something like that.
Isn't it Fatherland sort of set in the like the Kennedy era in US terms, isn't it? Like kind of
that is correct. Yes,
60s.
It's I think now I would have to check this to be very certain, but I think it's a wee bit later than that. Fatherland has Joe Kennedy, as in John F. Kennedy's father, winning a presidential election at some point. I don't think it's entirely defined when, but Joe Kennedy, who apparently, at least according to the thesis of this novel, and I would have to look deeper into the story, the history rather, to verify these events, but I gather that Joe Kennedy is generally regarded as somewhat pro-Nazi, and I think that in the novel, the German win in World War II is seen as one of the factors that catapults Joe Kennedy to winning the presidency of the USA, because the victorious party, etc. It's a good idea to have someone who is generally friendly towards them winning it. I think they end up, in fact, in that novel in some sort of forever war against the USSR. So it's never quite concluded on the Eastern Front, but as far as domination of Europe goes, that's pretty much secured. But anyway, that was my first experience of anything that could be described as counterfactual and alternative history. And if I could digress very briefly, I think there is a very slight distinction between the terms of alternative history and counterfactual history. I think that
I was going to ask you about that because you mentioned that in the first half. I was intrigued.
I mean it's very marginal, but effectively I think that if you're going to be writing a novel such as Fatherland, or a lot of the Harry Turtledove stuff, or anything like that, then the term you use is alternative history. If on the other hand what you're doing is more verging on the academic, so it's more like an essay where you take a scenario and try to analyze it, then that's where that's where the term counterfactual history tends to be used rather more. So it is a very soft distinction between those two sets, but I think that's probably where I would say that it lies. It's, how.
So they're both fictions, but one is fiction dressed up as non-fiction, essentially.
Well, yes, except that you could do a strictly non-fictional counterfactual piece where you are simply taking a subject in counterfactual history and strictly analysing all of the points from start to finish. So there's actually no fiction involved at all. You're simply saying, if this thing were to change, factors that we would need to address to analyse it would be A, B, C, D, E, and I'm going to, write sort of sub-essays that deal with each of those kind of thing. You understand?
The distinction, it just occurred to me actually when you were explaining that I want it wouldn't be my first exposure to counterfactual history or indeed alternate history, but one thing, I think I read it probably when I was in my early teens, but the book 1984, do you remember how in that you've got Winston Smith reading the kind of extracts from the sort of forbidden book?
Yes.
And those were bits that I read over and over again as a teenager. It's almost like the early interest in non-fiction over fiction in some respects.
Yes.
But they're kind of for the actual real world reader, they are kind of counterfactuals embedded in in that world. They're not counterfactual as far as we know. But
yes, you would have to, I suppose, if I were being super academic about it, I would refer to it as counterfactual intertextuality. And it sounds weird, but I think that's probably about right in terms of what's going on there. But yes, 1984 is a very interesting example when we come to not just alternative history, because it is ultimately a work of alternative history. I mean, particularly if you're somebody who's reading nowadays, going back, it's Orwell, or rather Blair, as his real name is projecting into a future, but he is also projecting into a future that explicitly looks back upon our past, a past that exists within the world that he's writing about. And there's so much going on if we read this back nowadays. What actually happened. There is a fan theory, as it were, that potentially everything described in 1984, including the works of Emmanuel Goldstein, in terms of the what you referred to as his histories of the world up until that point, literally everything is an invention of the party, to such a degree that we don't even know that the things that they say about the wider world are even true.
This is the kind of North Korean theory of
exactly,
isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, the airstrip one is, if it exists at all outside Winston Smith's head, essentially is an isolated rogue state, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I would think it would be difficult to form a view that suggests that Airstrip 1, being the territory that we literally do know, as in it is explicit in the text that territory does exist, that is not Britain. It would be hard. Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe it is some sort of bit of random territory in Central America or something like that. It seems difficult to believe because they do make explicit references to landmarks that exist in London and that have always existed in London. So I think I would say that the most we know about what's actually going on in 1984 is that there is a state that exists that is controlled under the most stringent totalitarian measures that one could possibly conceive of, and London is part of it.
Yeah, Alan Moore has some fun with that in a League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, his comic book series, where they have, the regime falling not that far into the 50s, and, they have characters who are involved in the sort of restoration government, like Orson Welles' Harry Lime and stuff like that. He has a lot of fun with it. You know what? We could spend hours talking about 1984, couldn't we? But it's not the main focus of this.
No, so indeed.
I'll get us back off it. But it's interesting, actually, you mentioned Fatherland, because, clearly, for our generation and the previous one as well, the what if the Axis had won the war thing is just such an attractive sort of idea. Well, not attractive. It's just such a, pick my words carefully, is such a fascinating and horrifying idea to pick at, isn't it? One of the earlier ways in which I came across counterfactual history in fiction and alternative history ideas in fiction was Star Trek, because I was a big childhood Trekkie, and I watched bits of the original series with my dad and mum before we got into Next Generation. So there's various elements there. I mean, two of the most iconic episodes of the original series, for example, City on the Edge of Forever and Mirror Mirror, are both episodes that deal with that kind of stuff. City on the Edge of Forever is literally what if the Nazis had won the war, and it sort of features a historical change, a point of divergence happens which winks the Enterprise and its utopian future out of existence. So that's quite famous. And Mirror Mirror is the for even non-Trekkies know, the one with Spock with a beard. It's the one where you get the kind of tyrannical dark mirror of the Federation, essentially, where it's very vague in that about any kind of point of divergence, but you get the implication that something went wrong in the development of the Federation to make it more tyrannical and more ruthless and brutal. And I think I forget the name of the person who wrote that episode, but I think Jerome Bixby, that's been credited widely with popularising, like real pop culture, popularising the idea of parallel histories running alongside each other. So these were both ideas that I encountered quite early in my childhood, really, and found fascinating.
Yes, and of course, the Mirror Mirror, I rather suspect that when it was written, it was intended as a one-shot. But of course, it became absolutely pivotal to the future development of the Star Trek franchise, because and you said that you were a childhood Trekkie. I'm an adult Trekkie, as in I discovered and fell in love with Star Trek much later in life.
Nobody's perfect,
Well, that's as may be. But, you saw so much development of this concept of the mirror universe go on. I mean, the Star Trek Discovery, the latest, I say latest series, I suppose it's probably persisted a little longer than Picard has, but essentially the entire premise of Star Trek Discovery turns out to be based on the mirror universe, and that's, leaving aside everything that happened in Enterprise, in DS9 particularly, a lot of stuff. All of that, the mirror universe just keeps on coming back because people are fascinated by this idea of an evil alternative to, the history of Earth and to everything. And we do have, interestingly enough, when we're talking about points of divergence, we do have one very clear point of divergence in the Star Trek history, which is the First Contact situation.
Yes.
And that's presented in the classic episode of Star Trek Enterprise. I know it seems somewhat heretical to use the terms Star Trek Enterprise and classic episode in the same sentence. Nevertheless, what happens is that when Zephyr Cochrane makes his first warp flight and comes back to Earth, then the Vulcans, having noticed this, come and visit us on Earth. Instead of what happens in the actual Star Trek universe, which is that this facilitates a meeting of cultures that ultimately leads to the Vulcans' paternalistic guidance of humanity towards a future in the stars and ultimately leadership of the United Federation of Planets. What they do is they form a mob and they go and jack the ship, essentially.
Yeah. Although that's still, because you very well defined points of divergence before on the pod, it's kind of an incomplete pass in that sense, isn't it? Because if it was to be a true point of divergence, you don't see what actually caused the mob to happen instead of the warm welcome.
Yes,
so that's,
absolutely.
Not that I'm taking this dead seriously now or anything. I'm just impressed you know Enterprise this well.
No, you're entirely correct, because you're absolutely right that in order for that to happen, there have to have been multiple extensive points of divergence, or even if they're not just points, just general divergences in people's attitudes and thoughts and feelings and such that go on right back through history.
Yeah, it was a good excuse to use footage from First Contact, though, which always goes down well.
Especially when you've got James Cromwell in. Yeah, if you've got James Cromwell to play any kind of significant role, you want to use that and use the heck out of it, I'd say.
You sure do. No disagreement here. I mean, I could spend ages on Star Trek, but we've not got the time. But I did want to mention the TNG episode Yesterday's Enterprise quickly because,
yes.
I mean, it's a kind of acknowledged classic of TNG, and in fact, I'd quite like to read takedowns of it, really, given how lauded it is. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because Next Generation doesn't have a mirror universe quote unquote episode, notably, but this is a different sort of take on that, and it's one that's interesting in again portraying a sort of dark and corrupted Federation, but it's sort of obviously a lot of, TNG tends to get described as, popular sci-fi, and it largely is, but it's always had elements bordering on fantastical, the old sort of Clarke dictum of, technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic, like look at stuff like the Q continuum, for example.
Yes, indeed.
But I mean, Yesterday's Enterprise has that thing that we were messaging before the podcast, David, and you were talking about the interesting idea of, some points of divergence are almost so plausible that you can end up with that weird kind of metaphysical feeling, that indefinable feeling that, are we living in the wrong timeline? You see a lot of like online discourse in the last year or so with people of varying political stripes saying, are we living in the darkest timeline? Stuff like that. It's interesting, isn't it, that Yesterday's Enterprise, not unique to it, but it deals with a bit of that kind of existential dread about divergence, doesn't it? The people, some people more than others, Guinan obviously is a sort of semi-mystical conduit in that, to this feeling of wrongness, but so the characters in the darker universe in Yesterday's Enterprise become aware that what they're living is in a sense not right, and they actually, obviously I'm not that bothered about spoiling episodes that old, but
yes.
They basically end up striving to basically extinguish their own existence.
Yes, but that is of course presented as a hard decision for them to make, and I think Captain Picard in that episode is probably the most resistant of all of them in terms of the philosophical idea of, is it reasonable? You got to think about it. Him in his position, having lived through the life that he did, he knows that a good, I don't know exactly how many, you're going to say 10 years plus anyway, of his life, that he has lived, and everything that he's gone through, everything he's experienced, it's not easy for a person in a position like that, confronted with the idea that perhaps something has gone wrong historically, that meant that none of that should have happened. What are you supposed to think in that position? Are you really supposed to think that everything you've done, everything you've struggled through, all the friends you've lost, all the sacrifices you've made were worth nothing, and that what you need to do now is to take a course of action that inevitably will invalidate it all?
Although I suppose it's presented in a more optimistic way, isn't it? However harried that, you're sort of magically restoring everything, or at least the potential of everything. So I suppose the thing is, because Star Trek is, I'll have some nitpicks with this, but Star Trek tends towards the utopian, or at least the optimistic.
Yes.
What they're doing kind of metafictionally in a sense is they're restoring the utopia of Star Trek, aren't they? They're taking you outside of the utopia for a second in order to validate the existence of what you've been temporarily removed from.
Well, I think you're entirely right in that analysis, and that is ultimately the conclusion that he does reach. What I'm merely suggesting is that if you put yourself in the position of that character, having had those experiences, then those are the sorts of challenges and doubts that you're going to be facing in that scenario. And I think it's interesting that there have been other franchises that have been trying to lean on Star Trek that have taken that sort of scenario and run with it themselves. One that I've become quite enthusiastic about is the Orville.
Yes,
it's an interesting alternative version of a Star Trek type universe. It's tending to take some of the aspects that people loved about Star Trek and trying to present episodic episodes, I suppose you would have to say, that give us the opportunity to experience that sort of universe. And when they finished their second series, which is the last that they've made so far, and I understand that they are going to be making more, but they finished it up with a couple that I felt thematically were extremely similar to the Yesterday's Enterprise type scenario.
Oh yeah.
Yes, you had a situation where there was a temporal anomaly that that changed an event in the past. But in this case, it wasn't something as significant as a battle having been lost or fought bravely or something like that. Here it was something quite as simple as a woman who was trying to decide whether or not to go on a second date with a man. And in the Prime history, she did, and then they ended up having a relationship, getting married. They did divorce, but the woman felt sorry enough for the man to use her influence to get him the captaincy of a starship, and various other events that cascaded from that.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Because it's like the sort of, and I'm thinking of something like Sliding Doors, the late 90s rom-com that involves sort of parallel timelines here. That's sort of the sitcomification of alternative history fiction, isn't it? That kind of bringing it right down to the relatable kind of day-to-day level of daily life choices,
Yes, that's exactly what happened in this story. And in the way that they presented it, you end up in a situation where the woman decides not to take the second date, and as such, none of this happened. However, because of events set up in her mind in the previous episode, she also knows, at least when it comes down to the disaster that occurs as a result of her decision, she knows that what has happened is a direct result of the decision that she made. And so she goes on a quest, essentially, to try to fix her own mistake, to try to restore the original timeline. And, of course, eventually she does succeed.
And then again, you've got that kind of idea of the rightness of a timeline, haven't you? There's not time to mention it now, but when you were talking about Fatherland before, I was going to say it's, one of the top two famous, Axis winning the war novels, with The Man in the High Castle being the other one. In The Man in the High Castle, there's also that sense of the awareness of the wrongness, that kind of creeps in. In that case, it's more from, Philip K. Dick's, sort of crazed perspective on the world that's mixed in with a sort of, Taoist mysticism and kind of 60s countercultural leanings and all that sort of stuff. But it's equally memorable. It's the idea of characters in a timeline sensing that something morally or existentially wrong has occurred, the same stuff we were talking about with yesterday's Enterprise, of course.
Exactly, yes. I think in yesterday's Enterprise you see the clearest example of it, because you have the character of Guinan, who very clearly does, because she's basically the central character of the entire episode, even though, as I understand, that wasn't the case in the original scripts as they were written, and she is the one who recognizes that there's something that's gone bad here, and that there's a thing that needs to be fixed.
It raises the interesting question, that not one we have time for really, but that, how on earth can there be anything, in a world where history does branch in this way and is mutable in this extent, how on earth is there one right universe? Of course, that's obviously something that fiction, and heroic fiction can just assert, isn't it?
It is, but I mean, it's something that Star Trek tends to reuse as a theme quite repeatedly in Discovery. In fact, I think my favourite episode of Discovery was the one with Mudd, where he had them repeating a timeline over and over and over again, so he could
saw that one. Yep.
He could try to engineer things in his way, but as it turned out, he wasn't the only one who had memories that could bleed over between timelines. Yeah,
and I suppose you might say that, in that episode, Mudd temporarily is like something akin to a Q, right? Just technologically aided. It's kind of, the Star Trek is full of, gods and wizards and people in between. So it's, that the powers that allow for that playfulness are there.
Yes, indeed, but it does appear in at least in the Star Trek universe, it does appear that whether it's a guiding hand or just the progress of time, there is a way for the people in what we may consider to be a prime universe to keep things on track.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember Rich, who's been on this podcast before, he's a big Tolkien buff, and we were talking once sort of slightly fatuously about the idea that, like an anthology you could do about kind of fictional universes and like kind of alternate history within them, but kind of keep it to kind of almost Biteback format length essays about them. And I'm sure that sort of thing's been done, but we hadn't stumbled across it. And we were talking, I was saying to him, would you like to write something about whether, what would have happened if Sauron had won the War of the Ring? And he was just, and he very, we had a laugh about it, but then he was just saying more seriously that, well, it would be fun, but that's kind of nonsense because it's a myth. It's not. There's no such thing as Sauron winning because the whole of Lord of the Rings is set up so that the point is that he doesn't.
Well,
it's not like human historical interactions. There's no feasible. Obviously, you can play with it because the Lord of the Rings has military campaigns and things like that, but it's not meant to be that kind of story, that kind of narrative.
Yes, I mean it might be a scenario for fan fiction, but in essence, alternative history is fan fiction for reality.
That's a good tagline. I might use that on the episode notes, actually. No, I quite agree. I mean, I said I'd come across alternate history like quite early in childhood from two sources, Star Trek, and I also wanted to mention Blackadder to you.
Yes.
Partly as a plug for one of the previous episodes of this podcast, actually, because episode 15, if people want to look it up, has me and my brother Matthew talking about particularly the first series, the Blackadder, which is the lesser watched of those and arguably not quite as good as the ones that followed. But we go into that. If you want to listen to that episode, have at it. But one thing we sort of touch on lightly there is that these sitcoms, which I saw quite early in childhood, and some of them are quite violent as well. So I saw them a bit younger than I should have done. Really, they're all kind of a little bit steeped in the idea of alternate history. The first one explicitly so takes place in in England where the Battle of Bosworth Field didn't quite go as we think it did, and there's a sort of hidden, not an alternate history, but a hidden history, a history that's been covered up. That basically is where the sitcom is set. I make the point to Matt in that previous episode that the other series of Blackadder that are perhaps more well watched, more well loved, and well known, they never quite leave that fascination behind. The second series, for example, has a sort of alternate bloody end to the Elizabethan era, for example. The third series has Blackadder taking the place of the Prince Regent, so it's sort of implied that our current royal family might be secretly Blackadders, essentially. And then, of course, the fourth series, even to the end, that famous episode where they go over the top, plays with the idea that the First World War we're seeing actually ended in 1917, even though it's it's a bit of a gag. It's a very somber gag, but and a very dark joke. But it never quite leaves that behind. And it's interesting, actually, because I was asking you about Blackadder before the podcast off mic, and you were saying that you one of your big Blackadder associations is that you were at the Millennium Dome to watch the Millennium special of that.
Yes, that's true. And I think when I think back on Blackadder, what always struck me was you had a general sense of downward social mobility, in the sense that in the original series, he was a member of the royal family. It would have been a senior member of the royal family. The second series, he's a senior courtier. The third series, he's basically a butler, and but a butler to the Prince Regent. And then in the fourth series, he has apparently no connection to the leadership of the country whatsoever, and is an officer in the armed forces.
I suppose you might say he's two different flavours of middle class in the third and fourth series, isn't he?
Yeah, more or less. But I would say that there was a general downward trend going on all the way through it.
Well, and all the way physically through into the trenches, I suppose. It's
well,
like
exactly.
Anyone in the trenches is doing that well, wherever they came from.
Well, indeed. I mean, you did have people who were fighting as officers in the trenches in the Great War, who were, on a decent standing, shall we say, socially, had there been no war going on. But yes, as far as how their experience of the war ended up, then yes, absolutely, that's the case. And then, when we talk about alternative histories, well, I think this may get back to a broader question here about the general connection between alternative history and speculative fiction as a broader genre. And I think alternative history is a subset of the speculative fiction genre. And I think that in essence what we have is a situation where people quite enjoy the idea of considering alternative versions of the world, whether it be in the far future or whether it be in the present where other things have changed a bit, or whether it be in the past where something changed and we're interested in finding out and figuring out for ourselves what the implications of that would have been. And in Blackadder, what we see is, I think, in Back and Forth, you end up with a Blackadder who perhaps has some form of ancestral memory of everything that his ancestors have gone through. And having found the opportunity to travel through time in such a way as to allow him to change history, well, he takes full advantage of that, and he does it. And I think maybe that might be one of the things that attracts people to alternative history and to speculative fiction as a broader genre, but, also including anything that includes time travel, because, there's a lot of stuff in fiction, whether it be in film, in literature, or anything like that, that involves people traveling through time in order to serve some end of their own. That's a very attractive concept, I think, for a lot of us. And in Back and Forth, Blackadder takes full advantage of that, and he basically engineers a situation where he gets to rule his world.
Yes, yeah. Which is actually, it's so interesting you should bring up Back and Forth, actually, because one of the, the most notable of the Blackadder special is Blackadder's Christmas Carol, which also has elements of sort of, successful or otherwise wish fulfillment in terms of, a character seeking to change their present and by implication their future. I wanted to bring up A Christmas Carol because this is one of my big when we're talking about alternate histories and the way in which it's a modern sci-fi concept that's taken root. I remember talking to someone at university about this, some late night chat with philosophy students about this. I think one of the interesting things about that sort of thing is Christmas Carol, hugely famous story, it's been overanalyzed to death. One of the interesting things about this as a piece of sort of mid-Victorian, mid-19th century fiction is that it presents alternate futures. Scrooge is presented with alternate futures, ways in which his life and indeed death could go better and worse. But the present that he is in seems to be immutable, or at least there's no changes presented. If you fast forward almost exactly 100 years to It's a Wonderful Life, again, beloved, Christmas associated fable and parable, about the good life, and it's you might say if A Christmas Carol is the iconic 19th century version of this, It's a Wonderful Life is the iconic 20th century version of this. In that 100-year step, you do have the idea of different presents. There's a famous bit in It's a Wonderful Life towards the climax when George Bailey, James Stewart's character, visits a parallel Bedford Falls, essentially. They don't couch it in that language. This is still, 25, 30 years before Mirror Mirror, for example. But you are shown a version of his beloved middle American town that is not so nice, that is not so rounded, that is more poverty-stricken, that is more mean, that is more venal, that is less welcoming, and he is given, it's couched in magic in that, but it doesn't really matter, really. It's all just an excuse, isn't it, to present these ideas. He's presented the ability to jump between these tracks, if you like. So I've never studied this in depth, but I'm sure literary scholars will know how that came to be and how those popular science ideas take root, a good, as I say, generation before Star Trek is presenting them on TV. But it's interesting, isn't it, that idea of the mutable present, it for our age, we take that for granted, essentially.
We do, yes, and I think that it's reasonable that that we should do that. I think if you look at works that have involved time travel, and that's another subject that I've become fascinated in. Any kind of work that involves any form of time travel, you essentially end up with two competing views of possibilities involving time travel. Number one is the fixed timeline theory, and number two is the alternative worlds theory. So in number one, the fixed timeline theory, if you can find some way to travel back into the past then you can potentially change something that when you go back to the present will have changed the present along the lines that, well, emerged from whatever you did to change it. Alternatively, in number 2, in the many worlds theory, and this I think is perhaps a little more supported by theories that tend to exist in the field of quantum physics. You have the idea that any time that something affects a timeline, what happens is there's a branching off of another alternative world that carries on its own timeline and that exists separately from the original timeline that you existed in. And you potentially can travel between those timelines, at least from the one that you started in to the one that you go on to create, to go on and affect that. So, when we come to the idea of the mutability of the present, I suppose it would depend on which way you want to look at it. If you take the original view, the sole timeline view, then you could go back to the past and you could change something, and then you could potentially travel right on back to the present and start experiencing the world as it is just there. Whereas if you're looking more at the many worlds hypothesis, then in changing a thing, then you're probably going to need to stay there to see it through, because otherwise you're not going to know like how things are going to be affected by your having travelled through time. But of course, all of this is more or less conjectural at this point, because just now we've not found any way to actually travel back through time. All of this is, and this is why I say that that speculative fiction is the ultimate genre that we're discussing here. It is speculative. We are considering the philosophical ramifications of the ability to do a thing that we know that just now we just can't do. So can you go back through time? Can you and what really happens if you were to meet your grandfather, decide you didn't like him much, and then kill him when he was a child? We don't know. We really don't know what the answers are to all of these classical paradoxes that are presented from something like this. And, the Hitler paradox, even before we get to the moral implications of it, if you had the opportunity to kill Hitler as a baby, would it actually be a good idea? Because, you know what the best thing Adolf Hitler ever did was? He lost. And if you killed him as a baby, how do you know that the guy who might have come up otherwise would not have lost?
And this is where I suppose that's where the more, would you call it, like sort of materialist analysis of history comes in, isn't it? Rather than the sort of great man theory, that the Second World War for ill needed a Hitler, so to speak, whereas it needed Hitler, whereas it would have got a Hitler.
Yeah, well, I mean, and again, that's one theory. It's one possibility. I actually do believe that individuals can influence historical events to a very large extent. But that doesn't mean that we have to exclude the possibility that there may not have been other people who might have come on. And, it's not as though... I don't say that Hitler's coterie was exactly populated by geniuses, but, I mean, well, what if it had been Hermann Goering? What if it had been Heydrich, and they'd had other paths that they could have followed? I'm gonna say out of hand that these people were complete morons and would obviously have died and lost the war and such. It's we just don't know.
Well, it's a way, in a sense, all these questions are ways of looking at the same data with just a different mindset in a way, isn't it? Or a different, different mood almost. Because it's possible for, as you say, the people that we were dealt, if you like, the cards we were dealt, they have greatly influenced history. But that's not to say we couldn't have been dealt different cards. It's kind of getting back to that, Picard in yesterday's Enterprise thing. He looks around at his world and sees what he thinks of as, if not inevitabilities, then facts that make sense. But we, the viewer, know that those facts are not the previous ones we've gotten used to.
Yes,
and
indeed.
been acclimatized to.
Yes, indeed. And I think you draw a very good analogy there. If you have knowledge of board games or card games, there's a distinction between the hand that you're dealt in a given moment and the game state at that point. And I think, that relates quite closely to what you've said there in terms of the distinction between the circumstances of history as they exist at that time and the people who are there in a position to take action during that period. But again, I mean, you go back far enough, you could potentially affect all of this stuff going on into the future.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, you know what, David? I'll wrap the show up at that point because I think we could kind of we could go on for pull an all-nighter here talking about all this. But I'm very keen to have you back on the show in the future, and I think we've touched on a few areas here which we could greatly expand upon. So before I wrap the show, I just wanted to give you an opportunity. Obviously, you've already talked about the work you've got coming out soon, and that will be all in the show notes as well, so people will be able to click through to that and find out about it. Would you like to tell people where they can contact you if they're so inclined?
Oh, absolutely. I'm on Twitter at DMBean. So anybody wants to give me a follow on Twitter, they're very welcome to do that, and I'm sure that any other endeavours that I may be making will be mentioned through that channel.
Thank you very much, and absolute pleasure having you on the show, and do keep well. And you've been listening to the EscapeGoat Podcast, as I'm sure the credits will reiterate. So that's all from me, and that's all from David. Say goodbye, David.
Well, thank you so much, David, for having me on, and thanks to everybody else for listening, and a good night, good evening, goodbye.
And goodbye from me. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat Podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications, or get me personally on @d_Fagiani. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.